Here are some basic truths that you must know when dealing with any case, especially if you intend to do a securitization audit or a forensic audit for any given court case. Then the Tier 4 meeting a few days ago, I mentioned certain things relating to the class of bond and that particular percentage of the worth of the amount attached to that class of bond being the requirement of the audit amount. Insurance law. It's the same thing that audit companies and rating companies utilize to do their job. One thing that I did not mention regarding the classes of felony and bond is a similarity that a lot of people should know. I mentioned that the statute of limitation to any given charges against people is basically the maturity date of the statute of the case. In furtherance of that, the class of bond is perceived similarly. In other words, there are different classes of bond. They use numbers. But when it comes to classes of crimes, they use letters. The equivalence of letter with number is the same. So if you have a felony A, B, or C, that will be equivalent category of a class 1, 2, or 3 bond. We'll use the federal jurisdiction as an example, but know that it uniformly exists with state level. The reason why you are using federal classes of felony is because the state adopt their classes of felony from the federal also. And the majority of the insurance policies that each states adopt are directly adopted from federal Congress. And of course, what jurisdiction rents the birth certificate and uses it, and also always runs to it with cases, because the birth certificate is what they attach to any of these things that we're about to speak of to validate how they use it as a slush fund. That jurisdiction is also the federal one. Classes of offenses under United States federal law. Offenses under United States federal law are grouped into different classes, just as much as bonds are grouped into different classes. So it is uniformly with what they refer to as offense. Offenses and their classes, or the classification of offense at North America, is uniform with the classification of bonds. No different. What ties and glues that classification of offense with classification of bond is that birth certificate itself, because that birth certificate is a bond itself. Remember that. And based on the classification of offense that they're bringing against you is what they use to determine how that bond is classified for them to cash out. Offenses and their classes, or the classification of offense at North America, is uniform with the classification of bonds. No different. What ties and glues that classification of offense with classification of bond is that birth certificate itself, because that birth certificate is a bond itself. Remember that. And based on the classification of offense that they're bringing against you is what they use to determine how that bond is classified for them to cash out. Offenses and their classes, or the classification of offense at North America, is uniform with the classification of bonds. No different. What ties and glues that classification of offense with classification of bond is that birth certificate itself, because that birth certificate is a bond itself. Remember that. And based on the classification of offense that they're bringing against you is what they use to determine how that bond is classified for them to cash out. I hope you're still with me here. Offenses under United States federal law are grouped into different classes according to the maximum term of imprisonment defined within the statute of the offense. The classes of offense under United States federal law are as follows: felony A, B, C, D, E. So they're felony charges. And then there's classes of felony, A, B, C, D, and E, based on the amount of monetary attachment of it and the amount of year involved in it. And then there are misdemeanor, A, B, and C, which have equivalent monetary attachment to it. The way that they guise this monetary attachment is by saying that it's a fine or a fee that they make you pay. No different than mortgage companies make you pay fines or fee monthly called the mortgage statement. But in truth, every time you send that mortgage statement, you are really paying for the premium for them to have a spot on the bond, the treasury, and contract in the default markets. For them to use that monthly fee that you're paying in mortgage to buy a spot to trade on the monetary value of the note attached to the house, which is a collateral. The same thing applies with court cases, whereby these so-called fines are just the monetary equivalents of how the bond matures and what they are making. Now, they kill two birds with one stone by making people a slave to say, hey, now go ahead and pay this. And also, that also gives them the cloud of legality. This is how the game works, that many should know but do not. Now let's transition. Now that we know that there are felony and misdemeanor, and then there are classes of felony and misdemeanor, and each of those classes have monetary equivalents. Class 3 to 6 bonds. Investopedia. Class 3 to 6 bonds get their name as a result of their bond classification. Remember, we've just read that crimes have classifications and monetary equivalents. Just as much as crimes have classifications, so do bonds have classifications. Right here, the offense, aka the crime, and their class, A, B, C, D, E. The crime has classes, so do bonds. Here's where rubber meets the road. Class 36 bonds get their name as a result of their bond classification, which is determined by their investment grade. If you've ever heard me speak about Moody's, Fitch, and AA, AAA bonds, that's what investment grade is. Investment grade credit rating details. What does it mean? It means that this is how the case is rated, meaning there's a credit rating to each case. There's a credit rating to each case because each case has a classification. An investment grade is a rating that signifies a municipal or corporate bond. Tell me, when they sue people, what type of courts do they take you into? Municipal courts. And we all know these courthouses are corporate entities because they have EIN. Right. They are issuing bonds. An investment grade is rating that signifies a municipal or corporate bond. Presents a relatively low risk of default. In other words, if you don't appear, which is the performance attached to that bond when you even further signed it to say, in order for me to be released so-and-so, whether you sign an I bond, D bond, whatever it is, because of course, when they say you committed an offense, what do? They arrest people. They take the biometric data, called the mugshot, fingerprint, all that. And then guess what they do when they release you? They have you sign a bond. That's how they release you. That bond is you initiating a consent, no different than in a closing table on a mortgage situation. That, all right, you're now the debtor, aka the defendant. The way they format you being a debtor based on that bond is as you being a defendant. Before you sign that D bond, I bond, whatever it is, that case, state of so-and-so versus John Doe, has never existed and will never exist until that bond is signed. That position of defendant is equivalent to defendant. And if you don't perform as a debtor, the nature of bond that they issue based on municipal bonds and corporate bond has a low risk of default, meaning it's insured by what? By that birth certificate, regardless of what class or grade it is. Don't worry, we'll get there. Bond rating firms like Standard & Poor's, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. You would have heard me mention these entities in videos relating to the PPMs or private placement memorandum and security exchange investment and things like that. These companies use different designations. Listen to this, consistent of upper and lower cases A, B, quote unquote, to identify bonds credit quality rating. Bond rating firms use different designations consistent of upper and lower case letters A and B to identify bonds credit quality rating. When you now go to the quote unquote offense of felony, you see class A, class B, C, D, and E. These are equivalent to bonds. Make no mistake. If it's a class A, by default, the rating of it is based on investment grade A. And depending on whether they indict you with more than one count, they bundle in it as AAA or AA. The more they charge you, the higher the credit quality. But whose credit quality? Because your bond is the one that's attached to that. Your bond is like a stem cell that can become a bone cell, a heart cell, a brain cell. The equivalence of the different organs in the body and different types of cells is equivalent to the different types of grades of investment. The bond itself is the stem cell. How they determine what type of organ, aka what type of investment grade that stem cell is converted into is based on what crime or offense or charges they bring against you. And the quality of that rating is supposed to benefit you because that's your so-called credit. But it's being referred here to as so-called credit or qualified as so-called credit because you don't have any way to show any interest to it. So all that trash people talk when it's my credit this, no, it's not, because you've yet to secure it properly. And most people don't even know these basics as to how crime is attached to investment grade on bonds. Well, here it is. AAA and AA high credit quality and A and B, triple B medium credit quality are considered investment grade. Credit rated for bonds below these designations BB, B, and triple C, ETC. See? These ETC is referring to D and E classes of felony, aka D and E classes of crimes. These things are not just here to look cute. There's an equivalence significance of court and finance, court and bank. When you're told court is bank, this is what it means. This is the functional reality of why the court system is organized intricately with pen and paper, whereby the large group of people who are funneled through that cyclical door in that courthouse are aloof to it. They screw people's lives up, but they are really doing business, making monies. Slowly and surely we'll be revealing the truth as to how reality works. When I say people in this western part of the world do not know how their system works, this is part of what I mean. When I say people speculate on things and intellectually masturbate, this is part of what I mean. People don't know things succinctly, but they have an idea. But it's all part of a growth process. Had you not known, here it is now being introduced to you. How investment grade works. Individuals and businesses are given credit ratings based on their credit history. Lenders use these ratings in this circumstance where someone charges you and attaches the value of that birth certificate to any case number. You are equivalent to the lender if you know what you're doing and you've secured your properties and affect property. If not, they subrogate you and flip that position. Lenders use these ratings to decide whether they will do business with and extend credit to potential borrowers. Similarly, investments are a given credit rating that lenders and investors can use to determine whether they want to invest in them. In this case, they're not giving you the option. The presumption is based on emancipation from your mother to the federal United States based on the Department of Labor, which we've shown in this video, which requires you to do emancipation if you really want to start having any sense of ownership beyond quote-unquote affidavit of ownership. The presumption is that they were the dragon spoken of in theological texts in the Western world Bible, where the dragon sat in front of the mother to devour the child. The federal United States and their agencies were that dragon that transitioned your life force directly from your mother to them. And because of that, they have a position in their mind of being a first lien holder. Therefore, they don't need your permission as a lender. Therefore, they don't need your permission to invest in it. And they can forcefully do it based on constructive trust. In this video, we went over constructive trust. Because constructive trust requires the assumption that you are engaging in some activity that's unlawful or fraudulent, and someone has to step in as a third party to prevent that. So they utilize that pretense of you being an offensive man or woman to society or dangerous to society in order to trigger some type of classification of bond and investment without your permission, but nonetheless regarding you, your soul, and life. And they kill so many birds with one stone by physically enslaving you also, keeping you in the cycle of willless slavery, of woes and fear. Because constructive trust requires the assumption that you are engaging in some activity that's unlawful or fraudulent, and someone has to step in as a third party to prevent that. So they utilize that pretense of you being an offensive man or woman to society or dangerous to society in order to trigger some type of classification of bond and investment without your permission, but nonetheless regarding you, your soul, and life. And they kill so many birds with one stone by physically enslaving you also, keeping you in the cycle of willless slavery, of woes and fear, like you will see in many people in today's world. No matter how they might want to pretend to be smart or wise, most people are sissies. They're afraid because they don't know these details. The more you know these intricacies of how these things work, the clearer you're going to see the reality behind what's going on and why the Constitution is so important to kill everything. And that's not even mentioning the fact that they're not even issuing these bonds properly according to the National Bank Act, which we went over in the video regarding Ascertain posted about a year and a half ago on Patreon page. Grade works just like credit scores. Grades, aka this right here, Class A, Class B, C, all that, work just like credit score. Meaning the higher up of the class of felony or misdemeanor, the higher quality of grade and credit rating it is. In other words, the more money they're going to make. And see all this supervisor release term of probation, that's the maturity year or the renewal years. Grade work just like credit scores for consumers and companies. An investment grade credit rating in the case of low risk of a credit default, meaning you don't show up, which is your performance based on the signature of that bond. You normally that bond will go in default, but based on the grade of it, if you don't show up, not a problem. They can still cash out. And in some cases, they will compel you to perform because they will mark your performance or quote unquote appearance in court within their underwriting department within the clerk's office. What people don't know is that each clerk office within any courthouse has an underwriting department within it, aka a closed corporation, which we went over in this video on Patreon. That's the reason why if people don't show up, they issue warrants to compel their performance, because that warrant is equivalent amount of money. So in investments, if a certain performance is not performed, there's an equivalent, something called literally warrant that's issued to kind of mitigate the issue. Well, they do the same thing in real life with court cases. That warrant they issue, they add salt to injury to it by snatching your body up. But nonetheless, on the back end, on accounting and bookkeeping, that warrant is issued as a form of insurance against defaults. On the back end, on accounting and bookkeeping, that warrant is issued as a form of insurance against defaults. On the back end, on accounting and bookkeeping, that warrant is issued as a form of insurance against defaults. That's the reality and function of how it works, in case you didn't know. An investment grade credit rating indicates a low risk of credit default, making it attractive investment vehicles. Vehicles meaning trust, because all those courthouses in their system are trusts, and the trustees of the constructive trust are the acting judges. The clerks are the role of the one just keeping the book and the records. Especially for conservative investors. A speculative grade, on the other hand, is the opposite of investment grade. This grade indicates that the investment comes with a greater degrees of risk, which is another subject matter. Now let's move on. Remember, we started with this, which is the classes. The grades are identified by the letter. The classes are identified by numbers. So class 3 to 6 bonds get their name as a result of their bond classification, which is determined by their investment grade. So the investment grade, A, B, C, AA, double B, double C, double D, triple through triple B bonds, right, equivalently with the class of the charge they're bringing up to you, that's the predominant factor. Which comes first, which is the grade, which then determines the class of the bond itself. These bonds are classified as non-investment grade for purpose of life insurance companies, fixed income portfolios in their general fund. This fund is where the acting judges use a slush fund, and they use insurance and trust as a form of banking and finance to cash out on your birth certificate, because you've been asleep, you don't know how trust works, and you don't know how private placement works functionally beyond speculation of reading some one man out and cracking the code and all these speculations, which are good. I say they're speculations because they're introductory, but they're not functional in any way. Most people read that and they're stuck there. Evolve, grow, move, invest in yourself. Don't think someone is obligated to hand you some free stuff. Grow beyond the point where you've been introduced to. Don't be stuck there. A non-investment grade bond carries a rating that signifies a higher level of risk or the likelihood that the bond issuer will go into default. Credit ratings are extremely important because they convey the risk associated with buying a certain bond. So much that when a judgment is issued, that judgment can be attached to the credit rating of either the defendant, meaning you. In other words, if someone had a default of a case, they can attach to your credit score. They can attach to your property. Well, you can do the same thing in case anyone does anything the wrong way against you if you're the plaintiff. And more importantly, you can actually lien the case itself, not the acting judge. Most people want to lien the acting judge, and that gets them into a bunch of trash. The people who's done that in the past, you hear nothing of them anymore because they're somewhere behind bars. They're doing it the wrong way because that's called financial fraud. But the case itself, which is the account number, that is what you want to target. But we'll leave that there. Understanding Class 3 to 6 bonds. The National Association of Insurance Companies, NAIC. Remember, for those of you on Patreon, when I made a video regarding NAIC and grants and trusts? Are you beginning to see where we're going with it slowly? Each of these videos add up into one. They're all one. They're not isolated, but it has to be introduced in different portions so that it's not confusing. The standard-setting regulatory body governed by state insurance regulators divides bonds into different classes based on their investment grade. In other words, the moment you're speaking about classes of felony, classes of crimes, classes of investment grades, you're automatically speaking of insurance matters. When you speak of insurance matter, you are speaking of banking. When you're speaking of banking, inevitably you are speaking of trust. They're all one, expressing themselves differently. If you've watched the video relating to the private placement, I think it's the 7th or the 6th part, I showed you how Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act merged insurance, banking, and investment into one. You have to functionally do things beyond speculations. For those of you on YouTube, you get this. You figure the rest out yourself. Figure the rest out if you think information is free. Keep finding free information. Here's one of it. Do some serious research, the dots together from here. But nonetheless, here's a good direction. Classes 1 and 2 are considered investment grade bonds, which are the least risky or the least likely to go into default. Classes 3 to 6 through 6 are considered non-investment grade bonds. Don't let this quote non-investment twist your mind. Without a doubt, it is still being invested on. They just use this phrase to classify the level of risk. They are considered a low quality investment because the issuer may default. Class 6 bonds are the most risky type of bonds to invest in. We'll stop there right now. The ultimate summary of this for you to realize is classes of felonies, or classes of offense, or classes of misdemeanor, or classes of crimes or charges against you are the exact direct equivalents of classes of bonds. And based on the value of it is what is used to determine how much can be made, how much can be invested. The statute of limitation is a maturity date. And if you're on probate one way or the other, that's another maturity date attached to it, or the renewal date. And they are simply adding salt to injury by attaching your life to it by way of that medium called birth certificate. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is the functional portion of that whole birth certificate rhetoric people speak of. Know how the system works so that it can work for you. Said this in the past and I'll keep saying it. The system is actually perfect. When you don't know how it works, when you work with mere speculations and anger and fear, then it's used against you. You can read all the PDFs and join a bunch of groups and do a bunch of secure party all you want. Yes, I'm mentioning that. I'm mentioning that particularly so that you snap into reality and snap out of delusion. You can do all that all you want, but you're really still not going to be clear about this as succinctly because the information you're looking for is in none of those groups. But the least you can say someone is not telling it to you. Deal with principles and truths and just be realistic. Until next time, take care. Best of luck.